to Thursday. And we are, of course, missing Maharat Rory Picker-Nice of the JCRC and Rabbi Carney Rose of Congregation B'nai Emunah. So instead, we have myself and Rabbi Jim Bennett of Sheremet. So this is a little bit of a flashback for the two of us because, the whole premise of the four of us doing this is that we are the four Hartman trained rabbis in St. Louis. But Jim, you and I did Hartman together when I was in Peoria and you were here in St. Louis, and in fact sat next to each other for most of those sessions, for most of those winters and summers. And I used to joke, I don't know how true it is anymore, maybe we'll explore that today, that you sat to the left of me, both at Hartman and, broadly. So we thought what we would do today is really, since it's the two of us and the two Reform rabbis, that we would really dive into what we see as our own Reform journey, our relationship to the movement, and a sense of what the movement is doing and where it's going, both here in St. Louis and nationally and internationally. Because there's huge changes that are happening, not the least of which is, of course, that the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College, the oldest, the original campus of the rabbinical school, the one started by Isaac Mayer Weiss, is closing, or at least the rabbinical program is closing. Where did you go, Jim? You went to New York, right? Am I remembering that?
No, I went to Cincinnati.
You went to Cincinnati too. Okay, so we're both Cincinnati alums. Yeah, with I imagine many of the same professors then.
Yeah, there was a great deal of overlap, I suspect. Some of my professors barely made it through our year alive, but mostly there's still quite a few who I knew.
Yeah. So let's jump in then. Will you want to start off just sort of sharing your Reform journey?
Sure, and it's just great to be here with you, Daniel. As you said, those 4 years sitting in Jerusalem together at the Hartman RLI program, or is that the RLI? Yeah, the Rabbinic Leadership Initiative program, were among the 4 most impactful years of my entire rabbinate, and I have left their mark and continue to on me and you. And among the many things I really cherish about those 4 years were the maybe chief among them, actually, is the opportunity to have met you and gotten to know you and developed a friendship that I know is lasting. And
I feel the same way. And I don't know how much people know about this, but right, like whenever I was leaving a job or looking at a job, you were the frantic phone call that I was making for advice. And
I'm so excited that you're back here in St. Louis now again, and that we get to work together in countless ways. So it's great. I also am excited today, although clearly we're all missing the other half of the 4 rabbis today, and look forward to next month when we're back together. But I'm also excited about the opportunity to kind of dive deeply into our own identities as Reform Jews, as Reform rabbis, as Jews in general, and maybe explore a little bit how that reflects or leads or follows the greater St. Louis Jewish community as well, in terms of how it impacts who we are and the work we do and the shuls we lead and the community that we're all working together to build. So just to kind of roll back, when I think about my life journey and my development as a human being, as a Jew, as a rabbi eventually, and for all these years now as a rabbi in my work, I cannot separate the impact of Judaism at large and Reform Judaism in particular from my identity and from my core values. And I think a lot of times along the way I've resisted this. I've tended to want to call myself just a Jew, just Jewish. But I keep snapping back to recognizing that my identity was founded on being a Reformed Jew. And in order to explain that, I kind of have to reflect just briefly biographically on my parents of blessed memory. My mother was raised in Albany, New York as a very observant Orthodox Jew, not what you would call today Haredi. She wasn't from a black hat family, She was from a mainstream modern Orthodox family, and they were very observant. They kept strictly kosher. My grandfather walked to shul every Shabbos. My mother and her two sisters were raised really within the synagogue community to be observant Orthodox Jews. And when she met my father, she was dramatically contrasted with his upbringing. My father was born and raised in Brooklyn, although his parents also moved to Albany when they were in high school, I think, or maybe when my father headed off to college. But his family was card-carrying, proudly banner-waving Reform Jews. My grandfather was extremely proud of being an American Reform Jew. They belonged always to Reform synagogues, but he was what we now reflect back on and call classical Reform Jewish. All sorts of things I'll talk about in just a second about what that means. And they met, my parents fell in love, they got married, and at the beginning of their marriage, they created a very traditional Jewish home. My father agreed to have a kosher home. My parents raised the first couple of kids in our family. I'm second of four. My older sister, blessed memory, and I were raised in our earliest childhood years in an Orthodox home. I mean, I can remember vaguely. I don't have many memories, but I remember keeping strictly kosher. We didn't walk to shul. That I don't remember. But I remember going to a conservative shul in my youngest years. And then suddenly something changed. And the folklore in our family was that my father finally looked at my mother one day and said, "I'm not an Orthodox Jew. I don't want to live an Orthodox life." And my mother said, "Okay, do whatever you want." And my father began to not keep kosher. My mother continued her whole life to be pretty respectful of kashrut, but in a way that only a true Reformed thinking observant Jew can do, in that she kept a kosher kitchen for a long time, but loved lobster and ate it out. And eventually, when there were four kids in the family and we were teenagers, we stopped keeping kosher. But when we would visit my kosher relatives, we knew what it was about. We respected it for the most part. And I was raised, and somewhere along the line, we moved over from traditional Judaism to Reform Judaism. We affiliated wherever we moved with Reform synagogues. And my most formative years, in terms of my Jewish identity, were in Fort Worth, Texas, where I kind of grew up. That was sort of 6 years of my wonder years, from like second through eighth grade. I became bar mitzvah there. And that's my Jewish identity, I think, was forged there at Temple Beth El, which in those days was a really mainstream classical Reform synagogue. I'll just give two quick examples of what that means. I was the first student in the history of the synagogue to become a bar mitzvah on Shabbat morning. Prior to me, bat mitzvah took place on Friday night during Shabbat evening services. There were no Saturday morning services. My grandparents, my mother's parents, wanted their grandson to become bar mitzvah on Shabbat morning. And so we solicited the congregation. I remember my parents had to go to the board of the congregation to ask permission to let us have a Saturday morning bar mitzvah, and miraculously, they agreed. My grandparents also brought a talit back from Israel, and they wanted me to wear it for my bar mitzvah. And up until then, you would never, ever find a talit in a Reform synagogue in Fort Worth, Texas. Just didn't happen. But in those years, my parents had enough friends and enough influence to convince the rabbi to approve letting me wear a talit. So suddenly, my Reformed Jewish identity represented a transformative change in the life of Temple Beth El in Fort Worth, Texas. We continued to affiliate with Reform congregations. I was super active in high school. We moved to Kansas City and then eventually to Indianapolis, and I was active in NIFTY, the Reform Youth Movement. My mother was always active in the synagogue. She taught music in the Sunday school. My father was always on the board of the congregation. they role modeled for me an active, engaged, knowledgeable Reform Jewish family. And that's what I understood Reform Judaism to be. It was open to change. It was committed to the individual autonomy and freedom of each person to make their own choices. And it was evolving. It was, it was ever changing and open to creativity and innovation and forgiving of people saying, well, this isn't what anybody else did before me, but I'm going to do that now. And so by the time I had my own epiphany in college and realized that I finally figured out what it was I wanted to do for the rest of my life, after digressing into briefly thinking I was going to become a actuary, studying advanced mathematics. I know that's hard to believe. When I was in college, I actually first enrolled as a math major. I really wanted to be an actuary, and then I found myself drowning in quantum physics and not physics, calculus, all this advanced calculus and all sorts of mathematical stuff that was way over my head. And I realized I wanted to study humanities instead. So I turned to philosophy and psychology and history and religion and landed weirdly as an economics major, but that's a story for another time. But my real love became thoughtful, philosophy-based approach to matters of the spirit. And I found that Reform Judaism and the Hebrew Union College in particular met my definition of what it meant to be a Jew and what it meant to be a thinking Jew. So I never even considered applying to any other rabbinic program. My mother briefly, I think, had floated the idea, well, maybe you should check the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I said, no, I'm a Reform Jew. I see myself as a Reform Jew. I always have, and I'm very proud of that. Not in a triumphalist way. I don't think Reform Judaism's any more correct than any other expression of Judaism, but I know that it's correct for me. And I know that the things that Reform Judaism stands for and always has stood for continue to be core principles and values. And, we could talk about this a little more later in the conversation if we're interested. The foundation of the classical Reform Jewish community, which a lot of people still mistakenly think is Reform Judaism, sort of the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, a rejection of Zionism and a rejection of Hebrew and a rejection of ritual, except the ones that lift us morally, and the promotion of social justice as the only core value of Judaism. That's no longer what Reform Judaism in any of our communities is, but it's still the core of it. I mean, I'll be honest, when we get to later on talking about our congregations and our community, I think the truth is that most American Reform Jews still kind of lean into those original commitments of the early reformers in Germany and then in America, the ones who said, we reject the authority of the Talmud and the Torah upon upon what we do. We elevate, what Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, said is the autonomy of the individual. That's the categorical imperative in our lives. That's the rule that we live by. And I'm really proud of Reform Judaism in that, because it allows us to be steeped in tradition, but to be totally divergent in terms of almost anything can be an expression of Reform Judaism, as long as it is thoughtfully arrived at by the Reform Jew. So that's kind of my personal story. I'll pause there and, we can react to that if you want to.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate you sharing that. And I knew a lot of that and had forgotten a lot of that. I forgot all about that you grew up in this sort of mixed household of traditional and reform. But I guess the part that struck me at the end is, I wonder how much actually we're all just Reconstructionist Jews these days, right? The articulation that you made at the end, particularly this notion, and you didn't use the word Judaism as a civilization, but I think it underlies all of it. And, not Reconstructionist as a movement, but Reconstructionist as a view that looks at this primarily as not being a religious tradition, but a civilization that has a religious tradition that goes along with it, and that's pretty different than classical Reform Judaism. Actually, it isn't.
It isn't. We could veer off onto this briefly and talk about it. I think that Reconstructionist Judaism, I want to be really respectful of the Reconstructionist movement, especially of today, because it has become a thriving and very legitimate expression of Judaism.
And ironically, kind of a neo-Hasidic rather than
yeah, they've gone in an interesting direction. But when I've studied Kaplan and when I read Kaplan and when I encountered Kaplan for the first time, Mordecai Kaplan, the intellectual founder of the Reconstructionist movement, I actually argued then, and I still do, that his expression of Judaism was not a new movement. It was a reform. It was part of Reform Judaism. And the movement has moved in ways perhaps that are with different foci, different emphasis than the Reform community. But I don't see a contradiction between the two at all. I don't mean to be disrespectful to Reconstructionism. And I will say the same thing later on if we end up talking about the conservative movement. I think they're all reforms. They're all part of reform. And Reform Judaism is a big enough umbrella that actually embraces, and I don't want to be arrogant to think that I can project into the future what's going to happen. But I think that the boundaries between Reform, Reconstructionism, humanistic Judaism, conservative Judaism, all these non-Orthodox expressions of Judaism are actually all part of the same thing that was originally in the minds of the reformers in Germany, in Europe, and then in the United States, that classical reform was not Reform Judaism. Classical reform was just one particular moment in time's expression. And I think Mordecai Kaplan actually was just being a Reform Jew. He was from the he came out of the conservative movement, but I don't know whether his own desires, needs, ego, whatever, led him to say, no, this is different. It'd kind of be like if I said, Sheremet is not Reform Judaism. Sheremet is Sheremethism. My congregation is a different. I'm not so sure that Reconstructionism is other. I know they're a different movement. I know that, the Reconstructionist community in St. Louis is a different group of people than the Reform community, but I'm not sure ideologically there's a differentiation.
That's been my sense, right? And at least the way that I was always presented with Kaplan was that he wanted to impact everyone and convince everyone that he was right, and only gave up that he wasn't doing it and started the movement. But ironically, I think I'm with you. I think we are all
Reconstructionists.
Not capital R Reconstructionists, but Kaplan Reconstructionists who broadly everyone to the left of modern Orthodoxy, probably.
Including the way I understand Zionism, which, cultural Zionism, which is very much Reconstructionist in its identity. The idea that we're creating a place that is a manifestation of Jewish culture and ideas and music. And so I think whether you want to split hairs and say we're all Reconstructionist or whether we say we're all Reform, it doesn't matter really. What I do think, and I say this not in a pejorative way, we are not Orthodox in that we do not believe that there is one true understanding of Torah and mitzvot and God that is binding upon us. To me, that is where the dividing line is. It's between truly Orthodox belief and practice and everybody else.
Yeah, right. Like I think we even see that simply stom in practice, right? Like look at the institutions, look at the Jewish institutions just here in St. Louis. And there are the communal institutions and there are the Orthodox institutions. And they are quite different, right? From the day school to the synagogues to the JCC to all of these things. There's a pretty big difference between them, even as I should say that the Federation has clearly made quite a bit of effort to include the Orthodox community under its umbrella. Perhaps even overrepresented is my experience now these days, is that percentage wise compared to St. Louis Jewry.
Which is not to be derogatory at all. It's not. And but it to define our terms, if by Orthodox we mean people who are true to Torah, who believe that the Torah is absolutely the word of God, that mitzvot are absolutely binding upon people to the best of our ability, I draw the line there and I say, I actually don't believe that. I don't believe that the Torah is God's word. I don't believe that mitzvot are given literally by God to Moses and interpreted by the rabbis and passed down to us. I think all of it is interpretation. Franz Rosenzweig famously said that. We studied that in theology class. Franz Rosenzweig, the great German philosopher, contemporary of Martin Buber, said,
I'm having flashbacks, and not in a good way, to rabbinical.
Oh, really? I love that stuff. I love that. Philosophy is my thing.
I love the philosophy. No, truthfully, I'm having a flashback to a paper due on Rosenzweig that was like, it was 2 a.m.
Did you ever turn it? Wait, did you ever turn it in? I think I still owe a paper from HUC that I never.
That would not surprise me. Sorry, Dr. Reitman.
Exactly. But when Rosenzweig said, "Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor," and God spoke to Moses, saying, Rosenzweig said, there ended revelation. At that moment, God spoke. The rest is interpretation. And to me, that's the differentiation between an Orthodox understanding of Judaism and a non-Orthodox. And I think we're all, whether you want to call the four-letter word liberal and say, we're all liberal Jews, or progressive, or reform, or non-Orthodox, or reconstructionists, or whatever you want to call us, we are, I hate to be Maimonidean about it, who, had his negative theory of negative attributes, that you can never say what God is, you can only define the boundaries of what God is not. I kind of think that's the same thing here. Maybe we can't explain exactly what we mean when we say we're Reformed. We can say we are not literalist. We are not Orthodox.
Interesting. Yeah, negative partisanship in movements too.
Yeah. I know I'm not that.
Yeah, for sure.
That could get us into a whole great political discussion here too.
Yeah. So
maybe you should share your journey, which I know is ironically a little similar, but mostly very different.
Yeah. So I grew up here in St. Louis, and all of my grandparents were very active over at United Hebrew. My grandpa, Daniel Bogart, whose house I live in, actually, he was the president of UH and actually got into quite a fight with Rabbi Grolman while he was the president, and quit and went over to Sheremuth. You look like you're going to say something. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and I have wonderful memories of him. He was really a great man, as are all your relatives.
Well, very kind of you. Whenever I go to UH and I see his picture on the wall, I always take a selfie, the two of us. It's in the line of the presidents. So I grew up, actually, my first Jewish experience was my parents weren't going to join a shul. My mom wanted to join UH. My dad, Davka, didn't want to join anywhere. So I guess even when I was little, I expressed a desire. So my Aunt Nancy, who used to teach at Sheremuth, Nancy Laitman, used to teach at Sheremuth religious school, would take me on Sunday mornings to her class. And those are my first memories of sort of organized Jewish life. Eventually, my folks joined CRC, and I ended up going also to Remote Emunah, the day camp over at B'nai Emunah. And I mentioned that, and I mentioned it in a few different contexts before, because I think one of the early values, ideas that I internalized was a sense that being Reform was less authentic. And I really internalized this, deeply internalized this. Part of it was growing up at CRC, this was not a movement-connected synagogue. From services to the way that we did youth programmings to everything, it didn't look like Judaism looked at sort of more mainstream Reform congregations. And so I never felt Reform as a child, other than, I knew the word Reform was in my synagogue's name. And beyond just not feeling Reform, I also didn't feel any loyalty to the movement or connection with the movement, and a sense that maybe it wasn't as valid or real or legitimate as conservative Judaism. For me, it wasn't Orthodox, it was conservative. And in many ways, this stuck with me. I ended up going, I always wanted to be a rabbi. I was a 9-year-old who wanted to be a rabbi. But I ended up going to HUC, the Rabbinical School of the Reform Movement, as did you. Not because I was connected to the Reform movement, but because, I don't know, it's the only place I really thought about it. It's where my rabbis, Susan and Jim, had gone, and Randy was at school at that time. And I didn't even apply anywhere else. I didn't think about anywhere else. And I got in, and I have such a memory of sitting in that year in Israel with friends, and someone mentions the URJ, and I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Oh, it's the new name for the UAHC." And I said, "What's that?" Right, just to show how disconnected I'd been. I'd never been a part of NIFTY. I'd never been a part of the youth programs or the any of that. And continued to have this sense that more traditional Judaism was a more authentic and valid way of being Jewish. So I ended up working at a conservative congregation during rabbinical school for 2 years, and really loved it, really connected with it. Ended up going after ordination with Karen to her student congregation in Peoria for 5 years, which was a Reform congregation. But even there, I was pretty open and vocal about the idea that I was not so Reform. And so I think it didn't surprise anyone when I left and went to a conservative congregation in Cincinnati. And that was the moment that I realized I was Reform. That's what it took for me, was to go and be a conservative rabbi. And, I actually think I could be a conservative congregant and enjoy that world, but I realized I'm not a conservative rabbi. All of the things that I had done in the past by choice, from keeping kosher to observing Shabbos, to all of a sudden they felt awful and yuck, and like they were a public obligation rather than a real thing. And I think Davka runs deep in my veins, is maybe part of what it is, right? A countercultural kind of thing. But I got there and just had this sense that I was out of my tribe, actually, that this was not quite my home. And a lot of this truthfully had to do with the fact that I arrived in 2016 at a conservative congregation and saw the election of Donald Trump. And this was a moment, in Peoria, I'd been very involved in anti-Islamophobia work, and they'd been very excited about that at my conservative congregation until Donald Trump was elected and rode in on a wave of, right, Islamophobia was really his first target, and at least first target of the campaign. And all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to do that work anymore because it was political. And it felt like that this was just the moment that my Jewish values were calling me to double down on this work. It felt like the most Jewish response I knew. And I was told that that's not what we can do in this congregation. And often that was presented to me within that congregation as being about the movement as a whole. But I just profoundly felt like I was in the wrong place and that I was doing the wrong work. And it kind of surprised me, actually, to see that even as I think in some profound ways, the experience of being a congregant in a Reform or conservative congregation can be pretty fluid, the job and the role and the boundaries of the rabbi are not. It's a different job in a conservative congregation than it is in a Reform congregation. And so I actually feel more Reform now than I have at any point in my life. I particularly connected to sort of the work I've done advocating for trans youth in our state. The support that I have felt and seen both for this work here in Missouri, but broadly and nationally from the Reform movement, and the pride that the Reform movement has taken in this work has been really powerful for me to feel connected as a whole. And so I can say I am more proud to be a Reform Jew today than I have been at any other point in my life, and really feel more connected to the movement than at any other point. But and maybe this is a place for our conversation to go. I think part of that has to do with the fact that I don't think there is a Reform movement anymore. There used to be an image of what Reform was. And I think we have stopped with that. We don't have set curriculums that are taught in Reform Sunday schools. We don't have we don't even have set prayer books that Reform congregations have to use. We don't have, right, any of these things. And this goes to what you were saying earlier. I really think we have become a tent for a wide swath of non-orthodox, non-literalist, non-halachically obligated Jewish communities. And that's a very different thing than I think the reform that we saw 2 generations ago, certainly, which really was a movement. And I think the conservative movement is still, to a profound extent, a movement. I wish Carney was here to reflect on that, but that certainly was my experience, even as there are many conservative congregants who I think experience it as a big tent. The movement itself, right? Conservative Judaism has a clear vision of what Jewish life should look like, down to even the Ramah camps, right? I was just talking with a friend who sent their kids to Ramah, and the reason they sent their kids to Ramah for 8 weeks up in Wisconsin, right, is because Ramah is designed to inculcate a certain ideology, right? And it takes time to really inculcate that in kids. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but there's a very clear ideology and way of practice and an understanding of Judaism that I don't think exists in the Reform world. I think there's a set of values that exist in the Reform world. But yeah.
Yeah, I think you've a lot of food for thought, and really interesting. I actually think our stories are oddly different yet very parallel, and actually in many ways end up in the same place, coming from different directions. And what you said is actually completely.
I just want to give a shout out that Joshua Molina, the actor, is on and is saying hi to everyone. So hello.
Wow, how fun.
Yeah.
Being defining ourselves by a label to some degree is limiting. On the other hand, sometimes it's accurate. And I think regardless of what we call the ideology that we have or don't have, I actually think there's meaning in the words. There's meaning to say, I am part of a reform movement, just like there's meaning in community. We could look at the St. Louis Jewish community. We could say, we don't belong to congregations. We just are all Jewish. We all belong to the Jewish community, or not, because there are some people who opt out. But we choose to go here when we go here and there when we go there. And to some degree, there's a lot of that. I mean, I'm sure you see it at CRC. We see it. I think everybody sees it. People coming because they want to hear a particular speaker or take a particular class or learn in a particular way, or their friends are going somewhere. And yet there's also a sense of belonging and identifying. And that is identity. My identity, I proudly call myself a Reformed Jew. To me, it's not just values. It actually is an ideology. And actually, when I've heard you on many occasions describe your affiliation with what I call Reformed Judaism, I think you do as well, because of the deep commitment that you have as a Jew to social justice work, to actually getting out there and making the world more right, recognizing what's broken and making it right. Whether you want to call it tikkun olam, whether you want to call it social justice, social action, tzedek work, that idea is deeply embedded in Judaism, but it was the Reform movement in the 19th century that actually said, this is the center. This is the center. Reform Judaism, I think those early Reform rabbis, actually, they literally rejected mitzvot, the ritual practices, the obligations to make meaning to all the 613 mitzvot in the Torah. They rejected that. They explicitly said it in the Pittsburgh platform. We reject all those observances and rituals and practices except those that elevate us, or they said those that work with our non-Jewish neighbors to make I'm paraphrasing now because I don't remember it by heart, to improve the ills of the world. And they were not making that up. They didn't just invent that out of, plain cloth. They looked back to the same Torah, the same tradition that the rabbinic Judaism of 2,000 years had looked at. And they said, no, we don't think that, parsing the difference between a hot knife and a cold knife when you cut your milk, your cheese, that's not what God actually wanted. I mean, we just read it on Yom Kippur. Isaiah said, this is not the fast that I desire. Isaiah said it is to, break the bonds of oppression and to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked. And, that the biblical prophets were expressing Reform Judaism's focal point. They weren't saying everybody should not be observant. They were saying this is where you should put your energies. And what I love most about the URJ, the Reform movement, which ironically, all the other non-Orthodox movements of Judaism, and to some small degree Orthodox Judaism, but I say to some small degree, have adopted that. Today, most non-Orthodox Jews will identify, when you say, what are you doing Jewish? Well, I volunteer at the food pantry. Well, I'm involved in a mitzvah project. For many Jews, that is thank God, it's the focal point of our Jewishness.
That was I've many times articulated my experience as a conservative rabbi that way, that I felt like I needed to be living Jewish values, and instead I was told that I needed to teach people to rep tefillin.
Right,
and
which
is tefillin. Like my tefillin are next to me right now, but
that's not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end. And when we make the ritual practice the end in and of itself, I think many, if not most people, say, no, not for me. Some people find it beautiful and meaningful just to do it for the sake of, and Reform doesn't reject that. You can lay tefillin if you want as a Reform Jew. But I think Reform Judaism says, why not invest your energy in doing things that then inspire you to be more, whatever, fill in the blank, more whatever. Generous, charitable, kind, respectful, and one other thought, because I could see you were about to say something, and Reform Judaism, progressive, liberal Judaism says inclusion. Rick Jacobs, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, famously made the centerpiece of his leadership of the struggling as it is Reform movement, widening the tent, making it a bigger tent by finding more reasons to bring people under the tent rather than strengthening the boundaries. So, for example, interfaith marriage, inclusion of people who are not born Jewish, but who voluntarily want to be part of our community, opening the tent wide to those who want to choose Judaism, whether through formal conversion or just through informal participation. It was Reform Judaism that aggressively brought in that tent. And it's ironic to me to see all the other movements of Judaism in non-Orthodox Judaism now saying, yeah. And many of my conservative rabbinic friends, by the way, across the country, wish that they were permitted to officiate at interfaith marriages.
They wish. Over and over, I hear that from conservative rabbis.
And I think someday the conservative movement will crack and allow that. It already is happening unofficially, but it's one of the great wedges that is preventing some of the branches of the non-Orthodox community from flourishing as mightily as they could, I think.
So a little bit of a tangent, but only a little. I'd love to talk about and explore notions of authenticity. My experiences and experiments into the conservative and the Orthodox world, truthfully, one of my big takeaways is sort of the realization that the emperor is not wearing any clothes wherever you go. Right, that the search for authenticity is always a search in vain. That it's the leprechaun and the rainbow, right, and the pot of gold. But I also think that part of this is that the Reform movement intentionally, in some profound ways, rejected authenticity, rejected the notion of it, and leaned into what we would now call sort of postmodern notions of truth, that there are no real answers that we can hold, that ultimately it's all relative and all down to the experience of the individual or the individual community or right, all of these sorts of frames. And yet I think there's something about humans that's hardwired to look for authenticity. And at least in the Jewish world, often we make the mistake of saying that antiquity and authenticity are the same thing, when of course they're not. So we'd just love to hear thoughts you have around this search, because I think a lot of people come to, in this, from liberal to fundamentalist religion, they show up at religious institutions craving something authentic. And we are a movement that almost rejects that, or often rejects that. I would say actually as a movement, we have rejected it, even as individual rabbis still often seek it and project it.
I love that you brought this up, Daniel. I really do. And if we had unlimited time, I would turn around and find on my shelf two things that you made me think about. One is, and for some of those listening, they will fondly, and others, whatever the opposite of fondly, remember the old Gates of Prayer prayer book that was for 25 years, the prayer book of most Reformed synagogues across the country.
Gates of blue, or gates of gray, or gates of red. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So in the Gates of Blue, the Friday night and Saturday morning prayer book, you may remember there were 10 different options.
I won't remember. I didn't grow up with Gates.
Ah, you did. That's right. I forgot. Right. Well,
my first real experience with Gates, other than B'nai Mitzvahs at Sheremuth, was showing up for my first High Holy Days at my student pulpit and being handed this book and being like,
"Oh no,
what is this?"
Well, and as familiar as it became to many people never really knew the whole book, because there were 10 options for Friday night services, and most congregations chose to use one of 2 or 3 of them at the most. The first one of those 10 was a traditional Reform service through most of the liturgy, Hebrew and modern English translation. The others had various themes to them. I think service 4, if I remember correctly, was a social action focused service. One of the services,
Polydoxy, right?
Exactly. One of them, I think it was service 6, was Polydox, referencing back to Rabbi Alvin Reines of blessed memory, who you're did you know him?
I didn't know him, but my grandpa was very.
Your grandfather was one of his great supporters, and actually, I was also. I loved Dr. Reines, and I loved Polydoxy. That service included a reading which I wish I could recite by heart, but I'm going to paraphrase it. It started out something like this. It said, "Once we knew truth." This is a long digression to get to this, Daniel, from what you asked, but the reading started out, "Once we knew truth, and then we realized that we didn't," essentially, to paraphrase what it said. In other words, once we had a sense of authenticity, once we were confident that we were right, and then, sort of reflecting years of evolution of philosophy, we came to a period after the Enlightenment where we realized what Immanuel Kant said, which is every human being is autonomous. The only authority in my life, the only authenticity in my life is that which I voluntarily accept upon myself, I take upon myself. And I loved that service. Nobody ever used it because it was way too heady, way too philosophical. The only congregations that used it were the early humanist congregations that ended up being Rabbi Sherwin-Wine's anti-God services.
I like Dylan's articulation of the same idea. I was so much older than I'm younger than that.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, I didn't think about that, but that is exactly. So when you talk about authenticity, I remember when I first moved from St. Louis to Charlotte, North Carolina, the executive director of my Reformed congregation there was a lifelong, very devoted and involved member of conservative Judaism, and was a banner-waving conservative Jew. And he said to me when we started working together, he said, I always looked down my nose at Reformed Jews. I always thought they were inferior. They didn't know anything. They didn't do anything. They didn't care.
That's the message I internalized, yeah.
Yeah. And he said that working at a thriving, vibrant Reformed community, he discovered, wow, all those things I thought were authentic, like laying tefillin, like you said, chanting Hebrew endlessly, 4-hour-long services for the sake of 4-hour-long services that most people don't come to until after 2.5 or 3 hours. All these things that represent authenticity, doing the way it's always been done. He said, I realized that's not authentic at all. What Reform Judaism said was not that there is no sense of authenticity or authority, but that the authority lies within you, and whatever you voluntarily choose on the basis of knowledge to do, that's authentic.
Yeah.
And so if I am strictly observant of kashrut, that's authentic. And if I choose to be an ethical observer of kashrut and only eat foods that are, produced by laborers who are fairly paid or treated well by their employers, or, ethical treatment of animals, all those, that's also authentic kashrut. Now, that doesn't make for community, because if everybody can make up their own rules for themselves, then that's not much of a sense of authentic community, unless you find a community of people who sort of share the same general perspective as you do, which is why I think there are different synagogues, different communities.
Yeah. In studying Jewish history, the piece that always stands out to me from the modern era is that Orthodoxy as a movement is as radically innovative, if not more so, than Reform. Right? Never before in Jewish history has conservatism, small c conservatism, been held up as such a central principle organizing value. Okay, with that, we only have 14 minutes left because I know you have to go at 1. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what we see as the future of the Reform movement, perhaps both in St. Louis and nationally. And I'm going to start by framing this around some huge changes that we have seen. Maybe the most obvious is the one that I mentioned earlier in terms of the original rabbinical school of the Reform movement, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, closing down. Even as the campus is going to maintain some sort of something, it's not going to be a rabbinical school anymore. But the other piece that I don't know how visible this is to people who aren't professional Jews, but the Reform movement as a set of institutions is a 20th, a 30th of the size that it used to be when I was a kid. We have so few people who are employed by the movement for the movement. We have so few people who are working to create and publish curriculums for kids or adults, or prayer books, or set standards, or all of the things that used to be the movement. Perhaps most noticeably, the total abandonment of the college program, which just does not exist anymore, right? It hasn't existed for about 15 years now, I think. And truthfully, the hollowing out of the youth program, the national youth program, NIFTY, outside of the camps. And one of the things that really struck me during the pandemic is I remember having a conversation with someone who works for the union who said that they had a number of campers who had to come in that summer, pandemic summer, that below which the union would collapse. That they couldn't pay their bills, it would have been the end of the national movement. And so I want to frame that along with the many discussions that my congregation has had over the years, including one just before the pandemic, I believe, about whether or not we wanted to remain in the URJ. Right, it's quite a bit of money to belong to the URJ. I forgot how much it is exactly, but it's not uncommon for a congregation to pay $50,000, $70,000 a year to the national movement, even as what the national movement does and provides has radically shrunk and shifted. So I think it's fair to say you are more connected to the machers of the movement than I am. So we'd just love to hear your thoughts on this and on the future and what's in store outside of it becoming a tent rather than a movement, which is sort of my perspective.
Yeah, no, it's great questions. I want to be clear. I'm not necessarily more connected. I'm just older. so I have a longer time.
Well, that was my nice way of calling you an
Yeah,
alpha
exactly.
cocker. You know, it was, yeah.
So look, I want to both agree and disagree, but I want to frame it by saying I am unabashedly, unashamedly, and perpetually an optimist. So I don't see the sky falling, but I do see the sky having darkened for a long time, in terms of the strength of the institutional part of the movement. I actually still believe there's a very strong reform movement. I really do. There are huge number, I don't know the exact number, but 900 reform congregations across the country. We have lots and lots of colleagues, although at the same time there is a crisis. Everybody knows there's a crisis of affiliation, a crisis of leadership. The numbers of seminary students becoming rabbis and cantors at not only the Hebrew Union College, but at the Jewish Theological Seminary and at most of the other non-Orthodox rabbinical and cantorial training programs are drastically lower than they ever were before, even though there are more institutions. So I'll take the questions you asked really quickly. First of all, like you, I was not disturbed necessarily by the decision of the leadership to close the Cincinnati campus. I was sad about it because it is part of my personal story and it has historical significance. And I do worry about the presence of institutional Judaism in the greater Midwest, because Judaism is in this country is so focused on the East Coast and the West Coast, particularly.
Yeah, and all these small student congregations that the student rabbi fly to every other weekend that just have no one now, right?
Right. There aren't students anyway, even if the campus is open. There's so few students, and now isn't even going to be a campus from which those students theoretically could come. So I'm worried about that, but I also recognize, as an economics major in college, I recognize, macro and microeconomic theory, that that decision had to be made. There was no reason for the Reform Seminary, for HUC, to support 4 separate campuses in New York, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem simultaneously. And which one closed, was ultimately just a matter of demographics and political and economic strength. Even if those of us who think we're smarter than the people who made the decision, might have made a different decision. Maybe we would have closed Los Angeles, or God forbid, chas v'chalila, we would have closed New York. But I think that consolidating that was actually, in the long run, a smart survival mechanism. As far as the movement, I agree with you that the URJ as an institution is a mere shadow of its former self in terms of staffing and footprint. And I'm saddened by a lot of that, because over the course of my career, there were many times that the movement was significant and meaningful. But I like to imagine evolution. I think about there's a new role for the movement, and it's not having a centralized office of education producing a curriculum. It's not having a centralized college office creating college programs. It could be imagining new roles, and I hope that's what's happening. I'm not really an insider at all, Daniel, but I will say there are certain strengths that they're trying to build on. NIFTY is much of a shadow of its former self, but there still is a national youth movement, and they are really working really hard to redefine and remake themselves. The camping program actually is thriving today. The URJ camps are thriving. They are a source of revenue for the movement, but they also are one of the most vibrant places in the entire country where Reform Judaism lives. And you didn't mention the Reform Israel programs, NIFTY in Israel.
Yeah, in the RAC, which we haven't talked about.
And the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., which ironically, it may have taken 100 years for the movement to catch up with the vision of those classical reformers who said social justice was the center. But the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. actually might be the heart of the reform movement today, even to the dismay of some of our more politically conservative supporters who don't like some of the things that the Religious Action Center stands for. But they are living Judaism. They really are living Reform Judaism. So I don't know. I'm excited about the future. I'm also excited, by the way, about the future of the St. Louis Jewish community. It looks different today than it did 40 years ago, but I think we're trying to be smart and make ourselves in new ways, and it's hard. It's easy for people to snap back to the way things used to be being the right way. But I like to imagine, what's that saying? Some people see things the way they were and say, why not? Why aren't we anymore? And some look at the future and say, why not? Why not become something new? I screwed that quote up, by the way.
It was good anyways. Now we'll just quote it to you. It's yeah. I think Jews in St. Louis who haven't experienced Judaism outside of St. Louis so much often don't realize how special of a Jewish community we have here, in terms of the composition, in terms of the ways that we work together and don't have to work together too, right? I've been places where it is the cartel is much thicker than it is here.
Right.
I'll give some credit to my rabbi, Susan Talby, for busting up the cartel here in St. Louis. But I guess to me, I share your sense of optimism for the Jewish American future. I don't have enough of an insight into the movement and the institutions of the movement, but again, I don't feel attached to the institutions.
Nor do I. I don't think they're dying, Daniel, but I think they are evolving and changing. I think the CCAR and the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Union of Reform Judaism of the next 25 years is going to look very different than that of the past 25 years. Who knows?
My sense broadly of my American Jewish lifetime so far, is that in many profound ways, I grew up in an era when progressive innovation in the mainstream Jewish community had turned into conservative, small c conservative, right? Conservative propping up of legacy systems and institutions. And my broad critique of American Judaism has been that there are these institutions that are propping themselves up to the detriment of American Jews often. And so I guess to me, many of the crashing downs of the institutions that we're seeing, I actually think is good. It's a part of allowing the soil to become fertile again for new things to grow. And I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing really amazing new things that are coming out in places where it's allowed to. And ironically, one of the things we saw in Cincinnati, which has an incredible foundation, unlike in St. Louis and Cincinnati, they took the Jewish hospital and sold it and turned it into a Jewish foundation. And it enables a Jewish community that is remarkable. And it's one of the things that drew us there. But the other thing that it does is it continues to prop up institutions and models that otherwise would fade and would have faded and should have faded, in the sense that propping them up prevents new institutions and new ideas that might better serve new generations and existing generations of Jews. So yeah, I see this as sort of wonderful creative destruction in a positive sense.
I agree with you, and
even as there's grief and real grief at the
I was
loss,
just about to say,
very important. Yeah,
I was about to say, it's not without sadness and loss. Whether it's looking at the history of synagogues that no longer exist, or organizations that no longer exist, people who've had to lose jobs in the course of this remaking. But I also believe I often reference that dramatic transformative revolution that happened in the year 70 after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the creating of Yavne, the new imagining a new Judaism. It took grief, but it also took vision. And I think we're living in an era when only when we reflect back on our era with hindsight, will historians be able to say, that was actually exciting and vibrant. And I'm excited to be part of it. I'm thrilled to be a colleague of yours. I look forward to our quartet being reunited next month. But thanks for allowing me to riff with you for an hour today. And I don't know what our topic will be next month when we reconvene, but you can be sure that it will be exciting to us and hopefully to our listeners as well. And I guess I want to, before I leave, I want to say Chag Sameach to everybody for the last few days of the Festival of Sukkot, and Chag Sameach for Simchat Torah, and a good new beginning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And we'll see everyone again next month.
Bye, everybody.